theater. So I am here because Linda asked me to address two questions that she had and then to open it up to hear what other people want to know about immigration. And if I know the answer, I will tell you. And if I don't know the answer, I will get back to you. I am by no means an expert, but I have practiced law for 20 years. I love what I do. I chose immigration law because people are really important to me. And I didn't want to be the type of lawyer who sat behind a desk and never talked to real people about real problems. And I am grateful I speak Spanish. I am not fluent, but I am getting there. And immigration was just something that kept calling to me, and I chose the university I went to because the immigration program was so strong. And I actually had, when I was a third year student, it used to be called INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services. And we had the general counsel teaching my class on refugee and asylum law. So one of the benefits of being in DC is we had all these great speakers. Um, and then we got to see it actually in practice. I could take the metro home and I could hear 20, 30 different languages being spoken. My neighborhood had people living from all parts of the world, and that really appealed to me. I didn't want what I had when I grew up in a small town in Michigan, which was very white, very Christian, very small town. I went to DC to have diversity and new experiences, and I was there for 32 years. That was fantastic. I raised my kids there. I got married and divorced there, and now I'm here. So the question which Linda asked me to start off with is to define three different terms or to talk about how they've been used in society, and then to talk about the legal citations. The terms are illegal alien, refugee, and undocumented immigrant. And I'm going to start with illegal alien and then go to undocumented immigrant and then refugee, because refugees are a category set apart. So basically, the origin of the word alien is Latin. It's alias, which means other or beginning to another. It was used in English federal law. And then when the United States when people started coming over to the United States, and then we all decided we didn't want certain people to be able to immigrate to the United States, the 1790 Naturalization Act was the first piece of legislation that actually contained the word alien. It was followed up by the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, and then it was really used probably until the last 15 to 20 years. It is still used in the US Code and the Immigration and Nationality Act, but the meaning has changed from what it used to be because, as I said, it was someone who was an other, someone belonging to another. It soon became a very derogatory and degrading term to say that somebody was an alien. And prior to the 19th and 20th centuries, there wasn't this idea that illegal immigration was a thing. Like nobody was illegal when they were immigrating, they were just immigrating. But really, it was Congress in 1924. They passed the Immigration Act of 1924, and it was the first act that established strict national quotas and created the US Border Patrol. For those who don't know, the US Border Patrol is usually the first government agency which interacts with people who are crossing the northern and the southern border. Customs and Immigration Enforcement is another agency which deals with people, but that's usually at the airports when people are flying in, not just crossing a land border. So it created a large category of people, of immigrants, and it designated that their presence violated federal law, and it called them illegal immigrants. And it basically shut the door to immigration for the next 4 decades. It favored North and Western Europeans who are seen as closer in appearance to the ideal American with white skin. Um, Aside here, I'm not saying that the ideal American is white skin, but the way we put together our immigration laws was very racist. It was to have people who looked a certain way, who had certain education, who spoke certain languages, and it very much discriminated against people who I would say were considered dangerous or that they would bring in a disease into the United States. There was all sorts of racist uh, language used when they were talking about the other. Um, but it didn't used to be that way. And I think it's really important to point that out, that this was a construct that we as Americans created. We created this construct of an illegal alien. So after the 1924 law passed, it started being used all the time. The New York Times had an article in 1926 called Over Border on Bicycle, which was talking about the Canadian border, and it used the word illegal alien. And then it started just being used in media and government documents. It was on campaigns. We saw President Trump in 2016 and then again in 2024 use the term over and over, but there is some history to it as well since the 1924 Act. People started talking about what it means to be illegal and saying how that language was dehumanizing, which it is. And then in the late 1970s, the Carter administration started talking about undocumented immigrants instead of illegal aliens. That did not take off, but Jimmy Carter was the first president to bring up that term and actually try to put it into law. In the 1980s and 2000s, people were still using illegal immigrant. And then there was a gentleman whose name is Jose Antonio Vargas, and he was a reporter, I think for the Washington Post, but I'm not 100% sure. And he lobbied for his newspaper to not use the term illegal immigrant and said that, this is an antiquated term which degrades people and is dehumanizing. And then he won. And I think it was the Washington Post started not using it. The Associated Press followed, the New York Times followed, and then the Library of Congress dropped the term illegal alien from any of the subject headings. In 2021, the Biden administration instructed government agencies to use undocumented non-citizen or unauthorized immigrant. And so today, we can have conversations about language and semantics, but for me, it's really important. Words are really important. And when somebody says illegal alien to me, I stop them in the nicest way possible and I say, do you mean undocumented? Because no one is illegal. And the First Nations, the Native Americans have talked about how no one is illegal on stolen land. And I understand that. And I think it's great that we are having these conversations. It makes me sad that we're continuing to have conversations like this when it's 2026. And so that's where that expression came from. Undocumented immigrant is something that government agencies have started to use to categorize people who come across the border and maybe they've come in with a visa, but they're an overstay. That's not an undocumented immigrant. That person is actually documented. They went to a US consulate abroad, they got a visa, and they came into the United States. Undocumented is also a way to think about people who may have been brought into the United States, not necessarily of their own choice, but they're here. An example of that would be the DACA students who, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Most of these kids came in with their parents. They were not 18 or 21 years old and made the decision, I'm going to cross the border. I'm going to start a new life. They came with their families. And we've seen that different administrations have given them some benefits and then taken them away. But when we talk about undocumented, to me, that's what it means. It means somebody who has not come in on a legal path with a visa or based on marriage or employment. But it doesn't have the derogatory tone to me that illegal alien does. And we can have a conversation about that if people feel like it does. I think our language is constantly evolving. And that's something I think that's something that shows as a democracy that we are growing and changing and open to the idea that thoughts we had before, which were normalized, are not necessarily what we want to continue. So the last definition is refugee, and that is the one that is actually in the US Code. It's 8 USC 1101 A42. And it is a definition that came from international law. It says a refugee is any person who is outside their country of such person's nationality and is unable or unwilling to return to or unable or unwilling to avail himself of the protection of his home government because of persecution or a well founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So refugees have been coming to the United States and been going to other countries for years and years and years. The first act in the United States was not the 1980 Refugee Act, which a lot of people think it is. It was the 1948 Displaced Persons Act. And it was basically an act which expired in 1952 but allowed 350,000 refugees who were displaced by World War II to enter the United States, and it created room within an existing quota system for them. A couple of maybe like 20 years later, we saw Cold War policy meant that we were allowing tens of thousands of Hungarians and Cubans to come into the United States, Hungarians who were fleeing Russia and Cubans who were fleeing Fidel Castro. And then post Vietnam, we welcomed over 1 million refugees from Vietnam. And that was when refugee resettlement agencies started. The United States government started thinking about how do we fund organizations to help people come, because we don't want them to just come and assimilate. We want them to come in and know how to grocery shop, to know how to use the bus system, to register their kids for school. And that's what the refugee resettlement agencies did. And then there was the last big one, the 1980 Refugee Act. And it basically standardized the international definition that everyone else in the world was using, but the United States had not. And it created the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I worked there for 4 years. I started off there uh, managing a $55 million contract that provided attorneys for children who either crossed the border without family members or who were separated at the border in 2018 when the Trump administration began that. Um, Children under the Trafficking Victims TVP, Trafficking Victims Protection Rights Act, are given the right to representation. And so I would go to different shelters where these kids were. ORR had shelters in 16 states at that point. A lot of them were along the border in Texas, Arizona, California. And I would meet with young children who'd been separated from their family members or who'd come in with a sister or brother who was also under the age of 18. And I would ask them, do you trust your attorney? Do you feel safe with your attorney? Do you understand what your attorney is doing when they ask you certain questions? And the fact that I spoke Spanish was really great. But I don't even think it was, that wasn't the greatest gift. I think the greatest gift was that I was a mother and I was sitting with very young children who were scared to death, who did not understand why they weren't with other family members, and they were in this cold place where nobody was speaking their home language, eating food they'd never seen before. And it was just very, very traumatizing. I know a lot of people who I worked with at that time left after the Trump administration ended because they were um, just kind of burned out from dealing with people who had had such trauma that they were not going to recover. A lot of these kids would get therapy, their families would help them, but those children were really damaged just by the fact that they were separated at the age of 3 or separated at the age of 5. And that really got to me. And so I switched to the refugee side. I decided I did not want to work with unaccompanied minors because I had 2 children at home and I would come home crying a lot of nights. And that wasn't a great look for a mom. So I switched to the refugee side and we created a manual. And the refugee manual was sort of similar to the unaccompanied children's manual in that it contained policies that the United States had that most people didn't know about. If you were an immigration attorney or a resettlement agency, you knew about it, but the average person didn't know what the policies were. We put them together in a manual, and that was under the Biden administration. And I know it was online for a while. It was taken offline, and I'm not sure where it stands today, if it's back online or not. But we've seen a lot of changes happen in the last, I'd say, 15 to 20 years on immigration policy. So the last thing you should know about the definition of refugee is that starting in 1980, certain numbers of people could come in. Until very recently, it was up to 125,000. And then the most recent president switched it down to 18,000, which is huge, over 100,000 refugees who are not going to be able to come in. And right now, the only people coming in are white Afrikaners from South Africa who are supposedly being discriminated against. In my time at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I don't think we resettled one single white Afrikaner. So it's just really interesting that 99% of the people who are coming in as refugees are white Afrikaners. But again, policies change depending on the government. So one last thing President Trump did is on his first day of his second term, he signed an executive order which suspended the U.S. refugee admissions program. It's called U.S. RAP for 90 days. And it basically discontinued federal funding for the 9 resettlement agencies. These are Church World Service, Episcopal Migration Ministries, Global Refuge, which used to be Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, the International Rescue Committee, World Relief, the Catholic Conference of Bishops. These are all groups that are very well known for working with immigrants and who have a very good reputation for how they use government money. All of their money has been stopped. And so I don't think we'll see 18,000 people who are coming to the United States as refugees. Right now it's at 6,000 and we're in April of 2026. The end of the fiscal year is September 30th. So, we can have a conversation about that if people are interested also about, what is the goal of the administration, or how will the United States be affected if we are not letting refugees in? How does that affect our world standing? How does that affect people in the United States who want to be a welcoming country and a welcoming nation? So those are my remarks from Linda's comments. And I guess I'll just say that I really am grateful for coming to Lincoln County and finding people who really have a heart for helping others. It's not that way all over the United States. It was in Arlington, Virginia, where I lived, which is why I was there for 32 years. But I have found a lot of people who say, what can I do? How can I help? And there's 3 great Latino organizations in town. Alex is with Actriz Cultural, and they're in Newport. There's Conexión Phoenix, which is in Lincoln City. And then there's Centro de Ayuda, which is also here in Newport. And all of those organizations do different work. They have different cultural events and different services. I think all 3 feed people in our Latino community. And I'm just really honored to be here. It's a pleasure when I can teach anyone anything about immigration, or just open the conversation to hear what you know, what you don't know, what you want to know, or to be able to vent and say out loud, this isn't my values, or these are my values. So with that, are there any questions? Hi.
On the subject that you just mentioned, the 3 organizations here in Lincoln County, I think the league members are generally of like minds with our concerns over the issues, but don't really know where to reach out and how we could be of assistance. So first of all, I would request that you send the names and contact information for those organizations to us through Linda or whoever. And the second part of my question is just, what can we do? I mean,
That's a great question.
we are an older demographic, but working hard to recruit some younger folks, and some of us are a bit tired, but would still like to offer some assistance. So
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind is, when I think about what you can do in your county, is show up when there are issues that affect everyone in our community, not just US citizens, but also non-citizens. A great example of this was when the US Coast Guard helicopter was taken from Newport's municipal airport and sent to North Bend. A very, very vocal group, very well-respected group, the Fishermen's Wives, got front and center and filed a lawsuit, and that is terrific. They have a lot of I think credibility in the county because their husbands and brothers and father-in-laws go out and risk their lives to do the fishing. But I also think that they took action because they knew they needed it. They were protecting their loved ones and felt that if the helicopter was an hour away, that it could not get here in time. And I think they made a very valid argument for that, which Judge Aiken and Eugene agreed with. But that was a perfect example. Newport City Council had a city council meeting. 800 people showed up. I was one of the speakers. I think there were 80 to 100 speakers. You just signed up when you got there and they called you in order. It wasn't, who's who, who's famous or who's important. It was just whoever wanted to speak. But one of the things that I really loved about it is I saw people there that I'd never seen before. I live in Depot Bay. I work in Lincoln City. I'm in Newport a fair amount, but I saw all these people who cared about an issue. And I would say that people cared about the helicopter. I would also say there were a large number of people who did not want an ice facility in Newport. And so it wasn't just the helicopter, it was this issue that was going to affect everyone. And more than just affecting our Latino families, I mean, it affects teachers, it affects people at the bank. It affects people who work in all different types of jobs because if our community became a place where it was dangerous to be driving, if you had black or brown skin, people would leave and they would go to places like, Salem and Corvallis and Eugene, and we would lose those tax dollars. But more importantly, we'd lose our diversity, we'd lose the fabric, the character and culture of who Lincoln County is. So I'm very, very grateful in some ways that 800 people had to show up because it really galvanized, I think, the community and talking about this is not an issue of people who have status or not have status. This is an issue of how it affects all of us in our community. And so things you can do to help, you can always give money. I will send the names to Linda Brown. There is a terrific set of cultural events. There is one in June that Acariz Cultural is putting on that focuses on Mesoamerican culture and music. A couple of weeks ago, there was an event at the Armory for Memorial Day that also had a cultural event with it, which had ballet folklorico, which are fantastic if you've ever seen them dance. There's lots of opportunities to get involved. Day of the Dead is always something that there's a celebration in the community. But really, I mean, to me, I think the most important thing you can do is if you have a neighbor you don't know whose skin color might be different, who you don't know their background, be kind, be loving, just like you would be to any of your neighbors. Give them the benefit of the doubt. One of the things that was so important, I think, was when these racist letters were sent to the Toledo and to the Lincoln city councils, as they were saying, people are going to watch you in the parking lot of the schools and in churches and at Safeway. And people came together and said, this is not our county. This is not who we are. We do not want this. And that was really, really important. That was when I started doing my Know Your Rights. And Actriz Cultural and Conexión Phoenix were two groups that gave me a lot of help in putting those on. And it became really, really important to know that people were scared in Lincoln County. They were scared because of what it meant for their family. They were scared to send their kids to school, and we should not have to live like that. So you can give money, you can go to organized events, you can reach out to all the organizations. They all need help with different things, whether you're serving tamales at an event or making phone calls. And you don't need to speak Spanish to be able to be helpful. I think a lot of people are like, oh, I don't speak Spanish, I can't be helpful. No, you can be very, very helpful. Sometimes just standing in solidarity is huge. So, next question. I'm gonna go for it.
Oh,
Yeah.
what services does Josh Santillo's law firm in Lincoln City provide? I assume that they were pro bono or used to be. Do you help me there?
Sure. I'm actually not with Santello Law Firm anymore. I worked there for a year. They do estate planning and none of it's pro bono.
Okay.
They charge people for it because this is a large retirement community. They do great work. I was the only immigration attorney there and I started my practice and I decided to go into practice for myself so I had a little more flexibility over my schedule.
Yeah.
My daughter's in Eugene and any chance I get, I jump in that car and I drive to Eugene to see this girl. But they do lots of estate planning, personal injury, and some business.
Thank you very much for that. That was just beautiful. And I want to thank the lawyers. I know I have been sharing lawyer jokes my whole adult life. But boy, do I think the lawyers have just saved us. And so my hat's off to you. My brother's a lawyer. I don't tell him lawyer jokes anymore. But I understand the importance of standing in bringing a lawsuit. And I don't really, I think I understand the basics of that, but how do you find somebody who has standing? And how do you get standing if you're an old white woman?
Great question. So I'm not going to give the legal definition because it's not right in front of me, but basically standing is when you have a reason to bring a lawsuit in a federal case, it has to be subject matter jurisdiction, which covers certain things. Sometimes, like in state court, it depends on where you live, or in circuit court, it depends on where you live. But standing is basically someone who's going to be hurt by an action that will occur if a lawsuit isn't filed. So you file to say, I have standing, I will be hurt by this. Um, the Fisherman's Wives showed us by filing that lawsuit back in 2015, and then again, last year, that standing is really important. People who are affected need to stand up and be the plaintiffs. But right now, there is something pretty awful going on in Washington State. There's an attorney by the name of Alexandra Lozano, and she resigned 2 days ago. Instead of being disbarred, they allowed her to resign. She won't be able to practice law in any of the 50 states. But she was an attorney who was talking to mostly Latino immigrants, and she was calling herself the lawyer of miracles, and that she was promising miracles. And she was taking money from people and saying that they were eligible for certain benefits, sending their paperwork to USCIS, and they were not eligible, which then brought them to the attention of ICE. So while I don't know her personally, I do know of a couple of cases of people who gave a lot of money to her. And, that's one of the things I think about with standing. Like, there's a huge lawsuit going on, and the attorneys who are bringing it are not immigration attorneys, they are litigators. And someone came to them from their community and said, I was the client of Miss Lozano, and I want her to be disbarred, and I want my money back. And so this group of litigators got together, even though they don't do immigration, they don't know immigration law. But it was about standing, and anyone had standing in that case who paid her. The problem is that people don't want to come forward and say I was a client because they think they don't have status, and they might be right, and they don't want to put their names and faces out there because then what happens if ICE is looking at these names in the newspaper? So they have had like 300 to 500 people come forward, but they think it's more like 1,000. She was in business for 18 years, and I bring her up because there's an organization called Luz Legal. Luz means light in Spanish, Luz, and it is basically her website that has been rebranded, and it doesn't have her name on it. It doesn't have the name of any attorneys on it or anyone you can call other than like an 888 number. But there are people in our community, not just on the West Coast, but all over the United States, who are scamming people who are vulnerable. And that's a way you can stand up. That's a way you can stand up to say, this is not okay. Yeah, it made me really sad, but I was really grateful that she resigned because there are people who gave her their life's savings and now will not have status because she lied. And that sucks.
So without standing there, I keep seeing the league filing amicus briefs in many of these cases having to do with ICE and others. What does it take then to be able to file an amicus brief as opposed to having standard?
Friend of the court.
Question, but I didn't ask it.
So-
Thank you.
Basically, anyone can file an amicus brief. It's usually an organization, whether it's a profit or nonprofit organization. But to file an amicus brief, you have to prove that your organization will be affected by the decision in this case. And you have to make the argument in the beginning of the amicus brief about why your amicus brief should be accepted. In some of these Supreme Court cases, there are 100 amicus briefs. So maybe, in a case, I don't know about the league's cases with ICE, but if you didn't have standing, that's why you would be filing an amicus brief, because you don't have standing to be a plaintiff. There's a plaintiff and a defendant, and only a plaintiff has to have standing. Someone filing an amicus brief does not. But they do have to prove that however the court case could come out would potentially harm their organization.
I'm not sure if I'm clear on how to ask this question, but you are an immigration attorney, you are not a criminal defense attorney. So is there a network of defense attorneys that you work with so if you're working with someone who ends up needing criminal defense, I mean, are there people in Lincoln City and in Newport or around, is there a network that?
So the answer to that is yes. I have only been here for 18 to 20 months, so I don't know all the lawyers here, but I have worked with Christina KL. I've heard great things about Catherine Benfield, and she's helped a couple of my clients. And then Susan Reese Painter has always been willing to answer any criminal question. In immigration, we call it crim immigration. It's the intersection of criminal law and immigration. So if I have a client who has filed for lawful permanent residence. He wants a green card. It's based on his marriage to a US citizen, but he's been convicted of a drug crime. You need to look at that crime and figure out if it makes him deportable or if it makes him inadmissible. So if you're deportable, it means, if you say, I did this, they're going to make you leave. If you're inadmissible, it means if you leave on vacation and come back into the United States, they will not let you back in. And so one of the things that happened this week was last Friday, the Trump administration put out a policy memo on adjustment of status. And they basically tried to rewrite Section 245 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. They can't do that. And lawsuits are being filed as we speak. But basically, they wanted to say that anyone who was applying for a green card who was in the United States would have to leave the United States, go to a consulate outside in their home country, and process in that way. And there are two major issues with that. One is that the consulates are overwhelmed. One of the things our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has done is fire a ton of Foreign Service officers. I know two of them personally who were fired. And so to get an appointment at the consulate takes time. You used to be able, with a student visa, to make an appointment and go in 3 to 4 months in advance. For certain countries, it's taking 8 months for students to get a visa, which means they've been accepted by their American college. The school has said, we know you're coming. They've sent the information to the consulate, but they can't get an appointment because there's not enough personnel. The second part of it is that there are people who come into the United States and they have overstayed their visa. So like you come in on a tourist visa and you overstay. If you are married to a US citizen, you are allowed to remain in the United States and you get what we call it a waiver to not leave the United States. But now under this new policy, they're saying everyone has to leave the United States. So if you overstayed your visa by a week, by 6 weeks, by 4 months, you won't be able to come back in because when you've overstayed for a certain period of time, there's bars. So if you've overstayed by 6 months, there is a 3-year bar. And if you've overstayed by a year, there's a 10-year bar. So if you go outside the United States to consular process, you won't be allowed in for 10 years if you've overstayed. And the Trump administration knows this. A lot of immigration attorneys know this. The American Immigration Lawyers Association, which every immigration attorney should be a member of, there's 19,000 of us in the United States. They put out a couple of great videos on it. And then there's been groups like the American Immigration Council who are also putting out educational materials. So if it's interesting to you and you want to learn more, there is a ton online that's being put out. It's like 5 days old, this policy, but we're going to hear a lot about it because it's not only unlawful, but it has the potential to drastically change how many people are even going to apply for a green card.